All right, so you know you're here because you want to like really cut through all the clutter and get to the bottom of, complex situations.
Yeah, without needing to, spend hours digging through mountains of data.
Exactly, and that's exactly what we try and do here. Today we're taking a deep dive into something really fascinating and honestly kind of unsettling. It's this period of really intense political and social turmoil, all triggered by something almost unbelievable. A massive, overwhelming number of blank votes in a recent election.
It's a wild scenario, right, to think about what that could mean for society.
Mhm.
And the perfect lens for us to look at this through is José Saramago's Blindness, his novel. Even though it's fictional, it really lets us dissect, the potential fallout when a whole electorate, like everyone, decides to just reject all the political options on the table. And we're not talking about a small protest here and there. This is a tsunami of blank ballots.
Exactly. It's like a huge collective shrug, like
Right.
none of the above. So, in this deep dive, what we're going to do is really extract those core events, look at how the government reacted, often in a complete panic, I'd say, and then get down to those fundamental questions that this kind of mass political nope brings up. So, we'll be looking at the government's, inner turmoil and the city's response, always keeping in mind that we don't want to lose you in a sea of, irrelevant details.
Right, cut to the chase.
So let's rewind to the very beginning. What was the initial reaction to this flood of blank votes? Inside the government, I mean. It must have thrown them for a loop.
Oh, absolutely. Initial reports point to just complete chaos at the Interior Ministry. Imagine, facing this total rejection of the whole political landscape.
Right.
Every single advisor scrambling, struggling to even comprehend, let alone respond to this thing they never saw coming.
Hmm.
And there was, some early talk of cracking down strong-arm tactics, but then I guess cooler heads prevailed. They realized that, in a democracy, well, at least one that's supposed to be a democracy,
Yeah.
that just wouldn't fly. It shows you how fragile power can be when it's faced with a totally new way of saying no.
It's like their whole playbook went out the window.
Oof.
So what did the interior minister actually do, strategy-wise, I mean?
Well, he went with a two-pronged approach. First, he made a public announcement, which, looking back, was actually pretty clever, even manipulative. He publicly thanked these 500 so-called exemplary citizens who supposedly volunteered to help investigate anomalies in the election. And get this, he even warns their families not to worry about them going silent because the operation is, top secret redread level. It was this brilliant way to make it look like they were on top of things, investigating, in control.
Classic misdirection. Create a sense of action to cover up the fact that you have no idea what to do.
Exactly. Now, the second part of his plan, this was kept under wraps, was a total change of direction. Initially, they thought about this, like mass infiltration of the public, trying to figure out why everyone was voting blank. But they scrapped that and went for intensive interrogation of those 500 volunteers. The minister's thinking, it seems, was to concentrate resources, focus on a smaller group, and basically apply pressure, physical and psychological, until something came loose. It really shows you how desperate they were for any explanation, any little clue to latch onto.
So they basically went from trying to understand the why to just wanting to find someone to blame.
Yeah, you could say that. Now, out in the field, those agents who were still trying to question regular voters, they ran into a brick wall, really well-organized one. It's like the voters knew exactly what was coming. They had all the answers right out of the electoral law handbook. They're throwing around chapter and verse about the secrecy of the ballot, the right to vote blank. You ask them point blank, did you vote blank? Said, well, I didn't, but even if I did, it's perfectly legal. Boom.
So they weren't just like passively resisting, they were using the system's own rules against it.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
They had this whole arsenal of tactics, pretending they didn't understand, claiming they were deaf or illiterate, and of course, just straight up quoting the electoral law word for word. It was deliberate and honestly shockingly effective. It drove the agents up the wall. Some of them totally lost it, started shouting insults, even getting physical. Sometimes other citizens would step in to defend the voter. But every single encounter ended the same way. Empty reports, no confessions, not a single one.
It's like they weaponized the system's transparency. Really powerful. Even the sneakier attempts at information gathering didn't work.
Nope. Some agents tried to blend into social gatherings, just casually dropping phrases like blank result into conversations, hoping to get a reaction, maybe a slip up. Nothing. Total radio silence.
It's clear the interior minister's plans were failing. What happened next? How did the government escalate things?
Okay, so this is where the Minister of Defense's idea, he called it a depth charge against the system, started to gain some serious traction. With the interior minister striking out left and right, there was this growing feeling within the government, although interestingly, not from the ministers of justice and culture, who were a bit more cautious, that they needed to pull out the big guns.
Ah, so a bit of internal dissent already.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm.
So the first of these, let's say, more forceful measures was to declare a state of exception.
And just to clarify for our listeners, what does that mean in this context? What does a state of exception actually do?
Well, basically, it lets the government hit the pause button on certain legal rights and procedures, in times of emergency. But here's the thing. It didn't really have much of an impact. Because the citizens weren't really actively pushing for their constitutional rights in the first place, suspending those rights went largely unnoticed. Kind of ironic, right? It just goes to show that these measures only really work if people know their rights and are actively using them.
So a big move legally, but not much changed on the ground. What was their next play to try and regain control?
They went for something much more targeted, something people would actually see and feel. A strict state of siege, specifically on the Capitol. We're talking curfew, shutting down all entertainment venues, military everywhere, constant patrols, no gatherings of more than 5 people, and ultimately a complete lockdown of the city. And just to twist the knife, they actually lifted the smaller restrictions they'd put in place in the rest of the country. The message was loud and clear. The Capitol was being made an example of, to humiliate them, basically.
Yeah.
The Minister of Defense even made this really blunt statement. They are not trustworthy and must be treated as such.
Wow, that's a pretty authoritarian statement. How did the Interior Minister try to spin that, justify such a drastic escalation?
Well, he tried to shift the blame initially. He hinted at, and then quickly retracted, this whole idea of international anarchists being involved.
Yeah.
He claimed they did a thorough investigation with Interpol, found nothing to link the international anarchist movement to this electoral boycott. He tried to frame it as a purely domestic issue. But it was pretty transparent. He was just trying to make it someone else's problem.
Pass the buck.
Exactly.
But that didn't really fly, did it?
Oh, no, not at all. The foreign minister immediately jumped in, all worried about this spreading beyond their borders. Other countries were already getting nervous. He even went so far as to call it a potential black plague. And you know what the head of government said? He corrected him. White. This one is white. Kind of chilling, right? It just highlights the potential global impact and how aware the government was of how this looked to the outside world.
So a lot of tension building up.
Yeah, definitely.
What about within the government itself? It sounds like there was some serious disagreement going on.
Oh, yeah. The Minister of Justice, for example, kept bringing up how unique this whole situation was, the mass blank votes. He openly questioned whether these increasingly harsh measures were actually going to work. The Interior Minister, as you can imagine, got defensive. He was all, I'm doing what I have to do. What else are we supposed to do? He called it a catastrophe.
Yeah.
The Minister of Justice fired back, saying his advice was purely legal, sticking to the law. And the Minister of Culture, maybe feeling a little left out, just threw in a comment about budget limits. So yeah, definitely a picture of a government cracking under pressure.
And what about the Prime Minister? What was his role in all of this? How did he try to steer the ship?
Well, he saw this stalemate happening, and he stepped in. He pushed for the immediate approval of that state of siege, and then he dropped a bomb. He told everyone he had a backup plan, a substitute or complementary idea to keep them in power if the state of siege didn't work. He was super vague about the details, but he assured everyone the president was totally on board. Then he basically told all the ministers, especially Defense and Interior, to enforce the state of siege with everything they've got. Bring those stray sheep back to the flock, prevent adversaries from turning into enemies of the state. A very hard line.
So they're really digging in their heels, but did all of this actually get them what they wanted? Did anyone break and confess to voting blank?
Not a chance. The whole intimidation tactic with the state of siege totally backfired. If anything, it just strengthened the public's resolve, which the government completely underestimated.
How so? How did the public respond to this crackdown?
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. Instead of caving to the pressure, people started to embrace the blank vote. It became their symbol. I voted blank. Stickers popped up everywhere, big banners saying, "We voted blank," hanging from buildings. And then the ultimate act of defiance, a massive silent march with thousands of people carrying white flags. At first, some in the government actually thought it was a sign of surrender.
But it wasn't, was it? It was more like, we see you and we're not backing down.
Exactly. The police tried to break up the demonstration, with loudspeakers announcing that gatherings of more than 5 were banned, but the crowd was just too huge. They couldn't do anything about it. The police commander started talking about tear gas, water cannons. Military generals wanted to bring in tanks, even paratroopers. It was a really tense moment. It felt like it could explode into violence at any second.
The whole situation sounds like it was on a razor's edge. What were the intelligence agencies telling the government at this point? What kind of information were they getting?
Well, here's the crazy part. The reports from both the secret services and the military intelligence were painting this picture of, like, total calm. It was like that famous line from the book, All Quiet on the Western Front, except for, of course, the soldier who just died. It gave the government, all the way up to the head of state, this false sense of security. They thought they could pull off their secret little retreat without any problems.
Wait, a retreat? You mentioned this before. What exactly were they retreating from?
Oh, yeah. While they were publicly acting all tough behind the scenes, they'd already decided to abandon the capital. They figured people might be regretting their rebellious behavior, but they wouldn't actually do anything to stop them from leaving. So in the dead of night, with the streetlights dimmed on purpose, the whole government machine, the president's palace, all the ministries started packing up and sneaking out.
Wow. A government just like ghosting their own capital.
Mm.
What was it like during this exodus?
Surreal. You had these shiny black official cars all over, mixed in with archive trucks guarded by heavily armed guys, police escorts, even ambulances. Inside their offices, they were stuffing their pockets with mementos, like they were going on vacation, not abandoning the city. And as these convoys rolled out, the streets were completely empty. Not a soul in sight, no anger, no cheering, just silence, like a ghost town.
So they slipped out under the radar. What was the thinking behind this whole retreat idea? What were they hoping to achieve?
Well, during their escape, the prime minister had this really telling phone call with the president. He was freaked out by the silence, the lack of people. He thought maybe it was a trap, some kind of coordinated plan by the citizens. Now, he didn't buy the anarchist theory, but he did call the whole blank vote thing a perfect theatrical stroke. His plan was basically to cut off the capital, let everyone stew in their own juice, let them fight amongst themselves as resources dwindled. He figured they couldn't sustain themselves forever. He also said, even though they all voted blank, you can't force people to think the same way.
Right. There's always going to be some kind of internal conflict or disagreement, no matter how unified they seem.
Yeah, exactly.
So how did they explain this sudden disappearance?
The president gave a speech, carefully wording it to make it sound like they weren't abandoning the people, but responding to these unusual events that had disrupted the quote-unquote sublime family harmony. He said the state of siege was actually for the capital's own good and blamed unspecified internal and external threats. He even promised that basic services like water, electricity, communications would stay on.
Trying to maintain a facade of normalcy.
Totally.
But behind closed doors, were they actually feeling confident in their strategy?
Not really. In private, they were getting worried. They hadn't seen any, let's say, positive outcomes from the state of siege. They needed to get people back in line and fast. The interior minister, he was kind of in denial. He was convinced that sooner or later, people would come around, see the light, as he put it. The minister of justice, always the pragmatist, sarcastically suggested that maybe the interior minister should light a candle and pray to the media to stop fanning the flames. It was pretty tense.
So cracks were starting to show what was happening in the capital at this point, in terms of everyday life, I mean.
Oh, things were getting messy. The city's cleaning service went on strike. There were debates within the government about how to handle that. The Minister of Justice was against using the city council as a weapon against the citizens. And then you had this tense phone call between the interior minister, who was now operating from the new location, and the mayor of the capital. And it all culminated in the interior minister just straight up asking the mayor if he voted blank. And the mayor gave a really vague, non-committal answer. The author actually points out a shift here, a glimpse of the vulnerability beneath the interior minister's tough exterior. And the mayor, he seemed to be starting to understand the power of the city's quote-unquote gentle insurgency.
So a real sense of things shifting beneath the surface.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, you mentioned the media earlier. What role were they playing in all of this? How were they portraying the blank votes?
Oh, they were definitely playing their part, especially state television. They started to really demonize the word branco, that's blank in Portuguese. The narrator describes how people cringed when they heard news anchors and commentators saying it, like it was a dirty word. The government was trying to make voting blank socially unacceptable, even shameful.
Wow, so even though they'd fled the city, they were still trying to control the narrative.
Totally. Now, despite all of that, back in the capital, the mayor was observing this city under siege, this ghost town almost. On the surface, things seemed almost normal. Shops were open, some cars were still driving around, but there was this underlying tension, a feeling of something bad about to happen. He even felt this urge to warn a stranger about this invisible danger, even though he couldn't explain what it was. And his personal life mirrored that emptiness. His wife was in the hospital, his son was in the army, his daughter was living abroad.
So the city and its people were all kind of in this state of limbo.
Yeah, totally.
And what about that big crowd that marched with the white flags? Did they just disappear?
Nope, they stuck around. Despite all the government's attempts to regain control from afar, they were still a force to be reckoned with. And they marched straight toward the head of state's palace and the prime minister's residence, both of which were, of course, empty. The journalists covering everything were getting nervous. They thought the crowd might storm the buildings, and they were criticizing the government for leaving the city with no police in sight.
The tension is just building and building.
Yeah, and remember, the prime minister is now operating from the new capital.
Right. So what did he do to try and get things under control?
First, he told his aide to go to the front of the crowd and tell them that the government was in a meeting and they'd be getting guidance soon. He stressed the importance of national security, of course. Then he got on the phone with the interior minister, gave him a direct order, make the crowd turn back. It didn't matter that the army had already failed. The prime minister put the entire burden on the interior minister to fix it, and he wanted him to do it through a radio broadcast.
So passing the buck again.
Yeah, kind of.
What did he tell the interior minister to say? In this broadcast, I mean.
It was very specific, very calculated. He wanted a speech that would stir up patriotic feelings. He wanted the interior minister to warn about homes being looted by insurgent gangs, which, is ironic considering the government might do the same. But he didn't want to admit that. And he wanted the interior minister to offer returning citizens the status of loyal propagandists of legality. Later, he changed that to legionaries. More dramatic, I guess.
Yeah.
He also ordered the announcement of the broadcast to be played constantly on the radio so everyone would hear it.
So a real propaganda push. But why didn't the prime minister just address the people himself? Why all the middlemen?
Oh, he said it was beneath him, because of his position. He was saving himself for a more important moment, maybe when he could declare victory or something. And then he gave the interior minister an ultimatum. The roads had to be clear by 8 p.m.
Talk about pressure.
Yeah, the interior minister was in a tight spot. And in a private conversation with his wife, he actually revealed that he wanted more power, maybe even taking over both the defense and interior ministries, total control. But he was so consumed by what was happening, he completely brushed off his wife when she tried to be intimate. It shows how much this whole thing was costing him, personally.
Wow, so even his personal life was being affected.
Totally.
So the announcement went out. What happened next?
The radio announced the interior minister's upcoming speech, and then they played the national anthem on TV, which was a pretty obvious shift in strategy. One of the TV announcers even criticized the government for not using television from the start. Shortly after, a helicopter took off, and they started broadcasting live footage of the traffic jam of all those cars trying to leave the capital. They called it Xenophon's Retreat, which is kind of funny when you think about it.
Yeah, a little too on the nose.
Right. But the big question was, would the interior minister's speech actually work? Would people turn back?
Yeah, that was the whole point, right?
Exactly. And after seeing that helicopter footage, the prime minister finally realized they needed television. He told them to add it to the broadcast. They messed up. The interior minister's speech was weird. He called those people who tried to flee incorruptible defenders of legality and their retreat a heroic act. Like, seriously. But he was still pushing for national unity and blaming a vague minority for the crisis.
So a lot of mixed messages.
Oh, yeah. And the media on the ground were reporting a mix of emotions from those returning. Frustration, anger, some patriotism, even loyalty to their political parties. Many were worried about their homes, being left empty. The helicopter showed the cars scattering throughout the city, so you couldn't really tell who left and who stayed.
So a lot of chaos and confusion.
Exactly.
Did the government think their plan was working?
Well, the prime minister and the president called each other, all happy, congratulating themselves. But they totally underestimated those people. The president even said they had dishwater in their veins, like they were weak. The prime minister started planning a cabinet meeting, wanted the president to be there. And he was about to praise the interior minister for his brilliant communication skills.
But something changed their minds, right? The helicopter footage showed something they hadn't expected.
Oh, yeah. Right when the prime minister was getting ready to pat everyone on the back, they saw it on TV. People were coming out of buildings, lining the streets. The reporter was freaking out. He called them insurgents and said they were going to block the returnees, maybe even loot their homes. He was questioning why there were no police and predicting violence.
So things were about to get really bad.
Yeah. And then the helicopter zoomed in on one particular scene. People were coming back to their homes, and they were being greeted by those who'd stayed behind. Not with anger, but with, like, they were expecting them. And then they started unloading their belongings back into the homes they'd supposedly fled. It was obvious. The whole retreat was staged. And the prime minister, all he could say was, shit.
He must have been furious. They'd been completely outmaneuvered. What did they do next?
Okay, so finally the president agreed to drop a manifesto from helicopters. But they spent days writing and rewriting it, agonizing over every word. It shows how much trouble they were having coming up with a convincing story. But then bad weather rolled in, and they couldn't even distribute the manifesto. So with the president grumbling, the prime minister launched this whole media campaign to convince everyone in the capital that they were, blind again, like back in that blindness epidemic from the book. The president still wanted to release his manifesto, though.
Talk about being out of touch.
Oh, yeah. And meanwhile, the interior minister was getting impatient. He sent these 3 guys to the Capitol, just told them to bring me results, whatever that means. It was a clear sign that things were getting more shadowy, more violent, maybe.
So who were these guys? What were they supposed to do in the Capitol?
These were like undercover operatives. They were linked to this failing insurance company that served as their cover. The interior minister's instructions were super vague, but they were told to do whatever it took to get results. He basically gave them permission to use force. The leader of the group, he noted that the prime minister had just taken over the justice portfolio too, which might mean he was consolidating power. Pretty ominous, right?
Definitely. What were they supposed to be investigating, though?
Well, that wasn't exactly clear at first. They spent a lot of time arguing about different surveillance techniques, which showed they weren't exactly pros. The leader eventually decided to try and identify their target using photos from his home, even though his subordinates had more direct suggestions. He kept putting off taking action, saying he needed to review his instructions. They were definitely operating in the dark, literally and figuratively.
So who was this mystery target they were supposed to be finding?
They didn't actually say his name at this point, but it was clear he was someone the government saw as a leader in the blank vote movement, or maybe just a symbol of dissent. And at the same time, separately it seems, a police commissioner shows up in the empty Capitol, along with an inspector and a second-class agent. They had their own instructions.
What were they supposed to do there?
Well, they were following up on a letter the commissioner had received. They were all business, no messing around with good cop, bad cop stuff. And their focus wasn't even on the blank votes at first. It was on that blindness epidemic from before. They interviewed someone who gave them a group photo taken after everyone got their sight back. And the commissioner was really interested in the doctor's wife, the one who never went blind.
The doctor's wife. She keeps popping up, right?
She does. There's definitely something important about her, maybe symbolic. So the commissioner took the photo and talked to his contact. He was really uneasy about there being no government presence in the city. He made a comment to the inspector about another woman in the photo, called her a prostitute. He was definitely preoccupied, and he made a mistake. He told them to approach the suspects at a specific time, which meant they could warn each other.
Oops. Not a great move. What happened during those interviews? Did they get any information?
Well, the inspector grilled the doctor's wife, wanted to know why she didn't go blind, but she refused to say anything. He also interviewed the black market couple, the so-called prostitute, and the old man. Their stories about the blindness were all over the place, and one of them confessed to a murder that happened in the asylum. The commissioner was watching all of this, and he realized they were looking for a scapegoat. And he started to think that the doctor's wife's real crime wasn't murder, but the fact that she didn't go blind.
So he's starting to see through the government's lies.
Yeah, exactly. And he couldn't sleep that night. He was trying to figure out how to stall the investigation. Then he got a call from someone called Albatross, probably the minister or someone close to him. They told him to deliver the photo and a list of names at Border Post 6 North. The commissioner tried to argue, said he needed the photo for his investigation, but they shut him down. So he agreed to the meeting, even used the password. But he had a plan.
Oh, what was he thinking?
He was going to give them an empty envelope. He knew the minister would be angry, but he was going to say he needed the photo for his investigation. He was trying to protect the doctor's wife. And then he noticed how quiet the city was. It was peaceful on the surface, but everyone was anxious underneath. He even had breakfast at a little cafe just to get away from the insurance company's boring food. It was like a little moment of normalcy in all the craziness.
A little bit of peace before the storm.
Yeah, maybe. Now, back in the new capital, the newspapers were mostly focused on international news. The government announced that they were going to consult with international organizations about the anomalous situation in the former capital. The commissioner thought that would really annoy the minister, having foreigners involved. He also thought about how society had completely broken down during the blindness, everyone just trying to survive.
So he's really seeing the big picture now.
Definitely. He went back to the insurance office, and his inspector and agent showed up late, said they had another assignment. Then the commissioner dropped a bombshell. They were being transferred to Border Post 6 North on the minister's orders. He told them the investigation was closed, nothing to see here, and he was staying in the city. Then he read the newspapers carefully. The headlines were all about the doctor's wife accusing her of murder. It was a smear campaign orchestrated by the government. He knew they'd released the photo to turn her into a public enemy, someone to hunt down.
So he had to do something to protect her.
Exactly. He thought about running, but then he made a decision. He sat down at the insurance company's typewriter and started writing. He wrote a detailed report of everything that happened over the last 5 days, all his findings, his observations, and then he took it to a local newspaper and asked them to publish it. He wanted to expose the government to protect the doctor's wife.
Wow, talk about a bold move. What did the newspaper say?
Well, they were skeptical at first. Understandably, they were afraid of what would happen if they published something like that under a state of siege. But then, the commissioner told them who he was. A police commissioner. That changed things.
Yeah, that would definitely add some weight to his story.
Definitely.
Huh?
And in the end, they agreed to try and publish a modified version of his report. They were hoping the censor would miss some of the key details or wouldn't understand how important it was. Later that night, the commissioner was lying awake when his phone rang. He figured it was about that meeting at the border, but he ignored it. He went out and bought all the newspapers he could find, the ones with the story about the doctor's wife. Then he decided to go back to the insurance office. He figured it wouldn't be watched because the government wouldn't want to draw attention to it before that meeting at the border. He took a taxi back, and when he got there, he saw it. A photocopy of the newspaper article about the doctor's wife. His attempt to get the truth out there, it had worked.
It's like watching a game of chess with everyone making these strategic moves and counter moves.
Exactly. And the main takeaway here is that the government was just totally unprepared for this kind of mass, unified act of civil disobedience. They fumbled, they panicked, they resorted to authoritarian tactics and manipulation. They completely misread the public mood. And in the end, they tried to frame an innocent person while a lone police commissioner decided to fight back to try and expose the truth. It's really a story about how fragile power can be and how even the most carefully crafted narratives can fall apart.
Yeah, it really is. The moments that stood out for me were when they revealed that the whole retreat was staged, how they went after the doctor's wife, and how the commissioner turned into this unlikely hero. It shows how many different perspectives there are in a situation like this. The people in power just trying to hold on, the citizens resisting in their own way, and individuals like the commissioner caught in the middle, having to make tough choices.
And Blindness, even though it's a novel, raises some really important questions. How do power and dissent coexist? Can you really control information when people are determined to resist? And what happens when a government loses its people's trust? These are all questions we have to ask ourselves, even in the real world.
It definitely makes you think about the power of seemingly passive forms of protest and how important individual conscience is when you see injustice. And it leaves you wondering about the never-ending struggle between those in power and the people they rule.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's a good place to leave it for today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for having me. It was really interesting to explore this with you.
And to our listeners, keep those questions in mind and maybe do some exploring of your own. See you next time.
See you then.